So welcome to the Heritage Barn Workshop. Hopefully y'all are in the right place. So my name is Jennifer Mortensen, and I work with the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation. So we are Washington's statewide nonprofit advocacy group. As I was just mentioning, we have a variety of programs, and that we house ourselves in our organization. We have a few different programs we partner with, and the Heritage Barn program is one of our partner programs with the Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. Two long names and lots of long words, but basically we're the nonprofit group for the state, and then we partner with the government group for the state that works with preservation. So it's a nice relationship that we have with them, especially because the barn program helps us further our mission of preservation around the state and broadening our community, outreach and things like that, and then gets the money out there, which is the purpose of the state program. So as we're going along, please feel free to raise your hand, ask questions. If we're going to get there later in the presentation, I'll just tell you, and if not, then it's great to have extra questions. So we're going to go till about 7:15, unless nobody for cemetery shows up, then we can go a little longer. I've got space till 8. Is there anybody here who also wanted to listen to our cemeteries presentation? Okay, so we'll see if anybody comes, and if nobody does, we can go a little longer. So how many of you know that your barn is on the Heritage Barn Register already, or know what that phrase is? Great, so we've got about half and half, looks like. So in 2007, the state recognized a need for the preservation of agricultural structures and Washington's agricultural landscape because the process of farming is changing. A lot of these buildings are becoming are going out of use and going into disrepair. And the state recognized this. We listed a thematic listing of Washington's heritage barns on our most endangered list in 2006, the year before. So we were a partner in helping get this legislation passed that basically set aside some money in the state capital budget. Well, it did 3 things. So it did, sorry, you can't see the background very well because of the light, but it established the register, it established the grant program, and then it established the committee. So it set aside the money for our contract to manage the program and the actual money for the grants. So I'm going to kind of go through this kind of piece by piece. And so we'll start with the register because that's the first step. So you need to be listed on the Heritage Barn Register in order to be eligible for the grant. Oh, I did skip ahead a little bit. So some of the public benefits of the overall initiative, which is those 3 pieces, are listed here. So first and foremost, retention of those working landscapes and the cultural resources on them, the barns, the buildings, but then also public benefit of just the view of them from roads, but also educational opportunities or tours for these properties that we love to see. And barn owners typically love to show off their barn and their projects, and so it seems to be a really great symbiotic relationship for everybody involved. So we'll start with the register. As I said, you'll need to be on the register to apply for the grant. It sounds like several of you have that taken care of already. So the way we've kind of divvied out the responsibilities within the program is wholly owned by the state, but the way we've divvied it out is they manage the register portion of it, and then we manage the grant portion of it. So Michael Hauser, who I was mentioning earlier, he is kind of in the field called the keeper of the register. So he's the person you contact. He's the person that says yes or no, your barn is eligible. He's the one who kind of helps people get their paperwork in, lets them know if they've got the right paperwork, and then he's the one who lets me know, yes, this person has done their due diligence and gotten their barn listed. So we are in close communication, but if you still need to get your barn on the register, he's the person to talk to. And then once you do that, it's grant application time, which is a separate process and a separate set of paperwork. I know it sounds a little bit laborious, but we try to make it as smooth as possible. And so the Heritage Barn Register, what we define as a heritage barn is any large agricultural outbuilding used for agricultural purposes. So house animals, crops, equipment, anything like that. And in addition to barns, the register makes space for all of those outbuildings that support that large agricultural structure. So be that a silo, a shed, a milk house, milking parlor, chicken coop, any of those things can be listed alongside the large main structure of a farmstead. And the eligibility for listing is based on historic significance and integrity. So those are two concepts that we use broadly in all preservation. And we apply them to barns for the Heritage Barn Register kind of in a broad way as well, because the register was created specifically so the barn owners didn't have to go through kind of the longer, more laborious process of listing in a local register or on the national register. And some barns aren't eligible for the national register. It's a higher designation. So we wanted to make the process kind of as smooth as possible, and we wanted to make this register that recognized barns for their contribution to Washington's agricultural history. So it's a special, unique register just for this program. So as I said, these two concepts that we deal with, the first is historic significance. And this can be based on a variety of things, but the two kind of categories that things generally break down into is the history of the place. So, important things that happened there or important people who owned it, or the physical features of the building. So if it's a special, unique design or it's a very excellent example, those factor into the significance of it. And like I said, the Heritage Barn Register is really geared toward recognizing the historic significance of all working structures. So, so by virtue of being a barn associated with Washington's agricultural history, you already have historic significance. So, I mean, there are certain farmsteads that have kind of above and beyond that, but for the kind of general level of the Heritage Barn Register, if your barn has been a working agricultural structure, you've got the historic significance. Then the other piece is the integrity. So integrity refers to the physical contents of the structure. Again, sorry, it's a little bright in here. But basically, the integrity is the ability of a property to convey that significance. So if a property has changed physically quite a bit, then it doesn't really display that history in the same way. So the steps of determining integrity are define the essential physical characteristics. So in a barn, they're pretty simple structures usually. They don't have a lot of ornamentation. They don't often have a lot of features like windows and doors. I mean, they have some, but not as many as other types of structures. So once you start changing those features, there aren't very many other pieces left in really quickly. So determine what those essential physical features are, determine what's visible. There's always a comparison to other similar properties, whether it's a similar type of barn or barns in a similar area, and then determine based on the significance what's vital. So what does a barn need to still have to make it still historic? So the state has the state has guidelines that we use. Well, actually, they're national guidelines that we use. We'll talk about this a little bit more later. And it's on the back of the guidelines and procedures when you have to make changes to a building, to do it sensitively so that you don't lose those really wonderful historic features and your barn has integrity. Sometimes material has to be replaced, and so it's not there is some loss of original material, but we try to do it as sensitively as possible. So you'll notice at the bottom here, condition is not a factor. This is a barn not in great condition, but it still has a lot of integrity because I bet you every piece of wood there is original when that barn was built. Changes over time can become significant. So in the world of preservation, 50 years is kind of the national standard. So and that's the standard for the Heritage Barn Register as well. So if you have a farmstead that was kind of founded in 1910, but underwent a major overhaul in the 40s or 50s, those buildings or additions can be significant in their own right as well, because they're over 50 years old. So it just depends on the history of the place and the configuration. So here is the Heritage Barn registration form. It's a little, obviously you can't read the text, but basically it asks for the barn information, like owner information, general information. Here's the physical features. It asks you to identify a section for the history. And then on the back, it's one line for each outbuilding or potential outbuilding. So those smaller supportive buildings are kind of listed as a whole farmstead in the register. Then it also, the register asks for kind of site plan and map so that we can tell kind of spatially how everything's related to one another. And then we also ask people for historic memorabilia or materials, whether that's, you know, a pamphlet, drawings, or historic photographs. So whatever information you have, we'd love to get that information as you're listing your Heritage Barn, or even through that grant process if you've found new things since it's been listed, because that helps us have a better sense of what resources we have had in Washington, because a lot of these resources as working buildings weren't documented in the same way that downtown buildings were documented, or the nice houses of the rich people were documented. So we love getting all this really great, rich historic material from the folks that love these properties. So when you nominate your property to the register, there's a review process, usually 3 times a year. It's reviewed by the ACHP. It's a group of professionals in history and architecture and archaeology and preservation. And they travel around the state holding their meetings, and they review both Heritage Barn Register nominations and the National Register nominations. So this is something that's happening all the time. Unfortunately, the next meeting is June 1st, which is after the deadline of the application. So if you're looking to list your barn in order to be able to apply for the application, the grant, there isn't a way to get your barn technically designated. So we've kind of arranged this haphazard process where you can send photos of your barn to Michael Hauser, and he can tell pretty well what's going to be eligible or not, as long as you kind of give him enough angles. And then we'll kind of, on a good faith basis, say, okay, you'll be eligible, so you can also apply for the grant. But I really want to emphasize that you need to talk to him first, because I don't want everybody taking a ton of time to fill out both the register nomination and the grant application, only to find out Michael says, no, sorry, you're not eligible. So if that's the case for anybody, if anybody's not on the register, we can talk more after, and I can definitely give you Michael's contact information. So the reason that we're in a little bit of a weird situation is because the money where this program, the grant program, comes from is the Washington capital budget, and that budget, the approval of that budget was delayed about 8 months. And so we're kind of scrambling now to try to get this program underway, because we couldn't get under contract, we couldn't start anything until that budget was approved, and that money was, the money was in the budget, for this program, but then we needed the official approval from the legislature. So we're working on a bit of a truncated timeline, and we're trying to make it work for everybody, but it's going to be a little bit complicated this year, and the length of time you have to do your projects is also shorter this year. Heritage Barn Register listings per county. So we're really proud to say we have at least one in every county. Skamania is our single listing county. We'd love to bump that up a little bit. So our total is 687. And I'm looking forward to the day where we pass that 700 mark. We've been in the 600s for a while. There was a big push for the first few years, and it's been growing slowly since then, so it'll be nice to see it get over the 700 mark. You can see where the kind of the density of listings is. I think maybe there is some correlation with the amount of barns, but Skagit County especially, and Pierce also, there is a love for barns in the Skagit Valley. So we get a lot of folks participating, and then Island County also has a pretty, Island, Spokane, and Whitman also have pretty dense amount of listings. We have wonderful plaques that you get to put on your barn when it's registered, and it's really fun to drive around the state and see these kind of peppered all over the landscape. And now we'll get to the grants. Any questions about the register process first? Yeah.
We got accepted for the registry. When does the plaque come?
That's a great question. So it is, they are produced by our sort of involuntary labor force at the state prison. So there's a bit of a delay depending on the situation. So Michael Hauser is the person to contact about that. So there's always kind of a bit of a backlog in trying to get things produced. So it's a financially efficient process, but maybe not a time efficient process. So right. So but it doesn't always happen really quickly. So but on to the grants, what I assume you are all here to learn more about primarily. So the grant program is still definitely a program of the Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, and it's managed under contract by us, the Washington Trust, by me, Jennifer. So the people eligible to apply for grants are nonprofit organizations, local governments, private property owners, and then leaseholders, of course, in conjunction with the private property owners. I would say the bulk, 90% of our applicants are private property owners, but we do get a few, counties or cities who own barn properties on fairgrounds or other places like that that do apply, and some nonprofit organizations like farms and other things that do educational programming that do apply as well. The eligible structure. So basically, if you're on the register. If you're eligible to be on the register, you're eligible to apply for the grant, which means you're an agricultural structure, over 50 years old, of course listed in the register, in need of substantial repair, and retain a significant degree of character and materials. So that's that integrity piece we were talking about before. So if there's been some major changes, like you've taken out all the windows and replaced them with vinyl, or put a bunch of insulation and sheetrock on the inside of the barn, those are going to be changes that make you ineligible to apply for the grant, and also for the register. Although don't really make a habit of going around kicking people off of the register. So eligible projects and expenses. So stabilization is of course key, and our committee tends to preference those projects that will go toward the long-term preservation, which is number 2. Preserves the historic character, features, and materials for the long term. So while painting is a really important maintenance thing, and we do fund some painting, the committee definitely tends to zero in on those structural stabilizations, foundation stabilization, and roof repair. Those are kind of the bread and butter of this program. Like I say, it's not exclusive to those, but those are those strongest applicants we see in each grant cycle. Ineligible, something that is not compatible with the historic agricultural nature of the barn. So putting in that insulation and sheetrock, installing a bathroom, things like that, or new construction. So we don't fund, even if your barn or your farm is a working landscape and you need a new chicken coop, that's great, and we would encourage you to do that, but you can't use the grant funds to do that because we fund historic buildings. So the evaluation criteria. The evaluation of the applications is a combination of all of these things. There isn't one that's more important than the other, but basically the applications get scored, for lack of a better phrase. I mean, it's more of a holistic view of each application. It does come down to looking at an application on its own merit, but we do sort of put scores associated with the applications just to get a spread of where we are, and each of the committee members does a scoring of each of the applications, and then we basically they get together and they discuss it. So cultural, historical and cultural significance. So as I mentioned, by virtue of being a historic barn, you have historic significance for Washington's agricultural heritage. But if there is some pioneering, farming method that was at your property, that gives you a little bit of a bump up. Or if there was a significant person who owned or built your property, that also will bump it up. The need for repair. So there is certainly a consideration for those barns that are on the edge. The extent to which it extends the useful life. So in addition to kind of not reconstruction is the wrong word, but rehabilitation projects that keep the historic material. We do understand that there have to be some changes, like taking out wooden flooring that's rotted and installing a cement pad. I mean, that makes a barn much more useful in a lot of cases, and we understand that some of those elements need to change in order to extend the useful life of the structure. The visibility from a publicly traveled way. So that's actually a requirement that your barn be visible from a public roadway. And then you get extra points if it's a scenic byway, a state scenic byway. The degree to which it leverages other sources of funding. So whether that's a conservation easement or other type of grant that you've been applying for. If there are other local partners involved, the state loves to be a part of larger projects that involve the community. So we don't get a lot of those. Like I said, it's mostly private property owners, but that does help if there is kind of a larger project going on. Readiness of the applicant to proceed basically means you have a budget that makes sense and you can show, or at least it's a bit of on the honor system at the application phase, of that you have enough money to proceed with the project. So it is a reimbursement. The grants are reimbursement grants. So you basically need to finance the project up front, and they get reimbursed for the grant amount after the work is done. So whether that's a credit card or a line of credit from the bank, or you just use some of your savings and then put that back after you get the reimbursement, that's up to you. But we do ask you to list on the application whether or not the funds are readily available. And then of course we look at those budgets really carefully to see if you understand how the grant program works with the match, which I will get into in just a minute. So that's readiness. And then, of course, geographic distribution. As a statewide program, we try to get the money out there all across the state. Even though there are lots of wonderful barns in Skagit, Island, and Pierce counties, we do want to try to get the money out there all over, east, west, north, south, peninsula. All right. Oh, and then, of course, special consideration. So a few items that will get you extra points in your application. Any working landscapes still in agricultural use. And if you have a barn that's in such bad condition that you have a working landscape, but you can't use the barn because you're afraid that it's a dangerous building, go ahead and write that in on the current use or your description of the property, that you're raising cattle on the property, but you can't actually use the barn for storage or for animal shelter because of its condition, and that's your goal for the future is to bring it back into a working condition. So that definitely, I want you to be sure to mention that if that is your plan. Listed in the National Register, so if you have that higher designation, that gives you a little bit of a bump. And then any outstanding examples, so any barns that are really unique or have like special features that not a lot of barns have, to give a bit of an extra consideration because those are not, a little bit fewer and far between than some other styles. So I do want to do a quick walkthrough of the document itself. But if in the future anyone has any specific questions or issues with the clarity of the document, please feel free to contact me. So basically the first page is basic property owner and applicant information. So if you are applying for a grant for a barn you don't own, you definitely need owner sign off, and literally their signature needs to be on the application document. Mostly we get, like I say, private property owners who own the property, and so they don't need to fill out the applicant section because the owner is the applicant. But often we'll get the parents own the property, and the children are actually doing the work, running the farm, and applying for the grant. So there are a couple of different scenarios that we get. And then a quick project summary, and then the budget numbers from the budget page, which again, as I said earlier, we'll go over. But project summary is basically just that one-liner so that the committee, when they're reviewing these, can go back and be reminded of what your project is. So, replacing the shingle roof with corrugated metal and rehabilitating the windows. That's a couple of elements in one short sentence. A bit about the status of the property. Here's the spot to talk about the current use or perhaps future use if it's not currently being used. And then we also ask for the historical use. But this is the section I want to focus on for this page. So this is really where your project proposal should originate. So we ask you to look at each of the building elements we have listed here. We have a couple other spots if there's something that we missed. And kind of rate them from good, fair, poor, or deteriorated. So, and in addition to rating their condition, we ask you to rate their priorities. So as you're considering the condition of your structure and filling this out, this should correspond with the project you're proposing. So whatever you list as in poor or deteriorated condition, that should likely be your first priority of fixing, and that should be kind of the first work element that you're proposing for your project. So this is really helpful for the committee to see the overall condition of the barn, but also to kind of help guide you in putting together a project proposal. Then here's a page about the historic and cultural significance, which will probably be a little bit repeated from the information you submitted on your register nomination. And then we get to the proposed work, the project proposal. So based on that sort of grid of the condition of each element of your structure, we ask you to split your project up into what we're calling work elements. So kind of discrete projects. You don't have to have 6, you can have up to 6. If you have more than 6, we need to maybe start combining some elements because you're separating it out a little bit too much. But an example of a work element would be structural stabilization. Roof replacement, window and door rehabilitation. So these kind of discrete projects, even though it will all be one large budget, one large project, but discrete projects so we can see exactly how the money you're planning to spend money, how much you're planning to spend on each element. And ultimately, if your application does end up kind of in the middle of the pack and the committee is getting down to the nuts and bolts of giving out the last few dollars, they sometimes do opt to do partial funding for multiple applications. And so depending on what you list as your number 1 work element, your number 2 work element, how much money is going toward each, that can be really helpful for them to parse out how they're gonna distribute that money. So with those work elements in mind, you can translate them to the budget sheet. So roof replacement, structural stabilization, that gets listed here. And then list the estimated cost from your contractor's bid, how much money from the grant you're planning to go toward each element, how much money in cash matching you're planning to go toward each element, and then how much in-kind matching you're planning to go toward each element. I have a couple of sample budgets that we'll go over in just a minute. The next page, again, it refers to those same up to 6 work elements. This asks for basically a timeline when you plan to have them completed and started and completed. And then this is where we ask, are those funds committed? Do you have funds on hand? And if you don't, please explain why and how you plan to get them. And then a few last sections of experience and qualification. So if you're doing the work yourself, then we definitely need to be thorough in here about talking about how you are qualified to do this work and work with a historic building and be sensitive to those historic materials. And then if you're hiring a contractor or consultant, engineer, anything, we do ask for kind of a one-page sheet of their professional qualifications and any other references to other similar projects they've worked on or historic projects they've worked on. So that sheet, if you're hiring somebody, can be an attachment. And then even if you're not doing the work, but you have maybe overseen other projects, basically list anything that will help the committee be confident that you can kind of see this project through from start to beginning. We'll go over this in detail. Basically, what kind of public access are you already planning to provide? And then any last additional information that didn't fit anywhere. And then the attachments. So one, any bids or cost estimates, please include any documents that helped you come to your budget numbers. So whether that's literally a contractor's bid, which we do require, or if you're estimating how much siding material you need to replace some siding and you're going to do that yourself, show us the cost estimate for that material. A one-page summary of the experience of anyone you're hiring, I just mentioned. A text document with image captions. It's really helpful as you're submitting your images of your project to know which side is the west, east, south of your barn. And when you show them a piece of deteriorated wood, what is that? Sometimes you can't always tell if you're zoomed in a little too close. Speaking of images, we do ask for 3 types. So kind of overall building images. So all the sides of the building, any interesting features that you want to point out, detail images of the project work you're wanting to spend the grant money on. So there have been a couple of applications that I've seen where the pictures were too small or fuzzy, and the committee reads the application and says, well, it sounds like a good project, but I can't see anything. I can't see whether or not there's deterioration here. I can't see any of the details they're talking about, and they have to kind of move on because there's no evidence there that there's need. So I always tell people, you try to get as high resolution, good quality images. Make sure you hold the camera still so things aren't blurry, and really get those detail shots of those spots that are deteriorating or that are in need of repair, so the committee can see and understand your project visually. And then the last, number 6, a context image. Show us a picture of your property from that public right-of-way, whether that's a small road, a highway, scenic byway, whatever it is. Just show us what the public sees when they drive by. And is there anybody here representing a local government or a nonprofit group? Okay. A couple extra attachments with them. And then the signatures page. As I mentioned, we definitely need owner signature. And if you're applying for the owner, we need both signatures. So, matching funds. So as I said, it's a reimbursement grant. It is also a matching grant. So we require a 1-to-1 match, which means that for every dollar the state puts in, we require you to put in $1. However, you don't have to provide that dollar in cash. You can provide it in in-kind labor, materials, or equipment if that is an option for you. So donated volunteer labor, which would be basically just kind of low-level tasks like cleaning up or painting, or, well, painting doesn't always have to be a low-level task, but some of these things that you or some volunteers or family members would be willing to do themselves is counted at $15 an hour. If you have a professional laborer who is willing to donate their time, a carpenter or a roofer who's willing to work on your barn for free as long as you buy the materials, that you can count their market value of their rate, but we do ask for their professional credentials. So it's not just, oh, I know how to roof, I'll charge, I think what the market rate is. No, it has to be a person who works regularly in that industry. And then any equipment. So if you need a backhoe or a scissor lift or something that your neighbor has, and they're willing to donate that to your project, you can go online, find out how much it would cost to rent that each day, and that can count toward your match. So I should mention, in kind, whether it's labor, material, or equipment, can only count toward match. So we're not able to pay you $300 a day for something that has been donated to your project, but it can count toward that one-to-one match that you need to show. So here's an example of a very simple one work element project. $20,000 to replace the roof is the overall budget. So because it has to be one-to-one matching, you can request up to half, which is $10,000 from the state, and then you provide the other half, which is also $10,000 in this case. So as I said, it can be cash or any of those donated items we talked about. And then here's what that might look like on the budget page. So we've got the work element here, the total cost listed here. You're asking for $10,000 in grants. You're going to provide $10,000 in cash matching. These will tally automatically. This will all tally automatically and show that you've asked for 10. You're providing 10. The total is 20, and you have no budget discrepancy. An example of an improperly filled out budget would be this. So say you're wanting to apply for the grant, but you only have $5,000 on hand. So you write that you would like 15 in a grant, and you're providing 5. You'll see that that all adds up, and it actually you're 10,000 short. So this number is 10,000 less than you're asking, because those numbers should be equal, or your matching should be more, or can be more. It doesn't have to be. So if you see any dollars here above 0, that means that you've got to rework your budget. You've got to fix it. And I'm happy to help at any point in the process to kind of work on this budget sheet. This is a budget sheet that I made up this year because we had a lot of problems with our last budget sheet. So hopefully it's clear. Maybe we'll have to tweak it again in future cycles if it's still giving people trouble, but hopefully it'll work out. So we'll do an example of a more complicated project with multiple work elements. Yeah?
I just was wondering where you would put any kind of equipment. Would you prefer that on the labor side or material side?
That would be materials.
Okay.
Should probably have clarified that. Yeah, I didn't include an equipment. Yeah, put that under materials. Thank you for asking that. This is an update for next time. And then I'll remember to tell that to anybody else who asks. So let's do an example of a little bit more complicated project here. This is a more comprehensive rehabilitation, $50,000 total budget. So you can ask for up to 25 from the state, and then you provide 25. So I've put this in the budget sheet in basically just a for instance fashion. So it doesn't matter to us how you plan to arrange your finances and what you're planning to spend the money on at what time. We want that to be as convenient for your finances as possible. So you're welcome to arrange this in any way you like. You can do, I could have done this so that half of each of these is all grant, but in this case I've decided I'll do grant to the two main structural components that the committee likes to see, because I know that's what the committee likes to see. And I'm here to help you know that when you're filling out your application. So in this instance, I'm putting $15,000 of the grant toward the whole foundation repair, which is 15. And then I've got another 10 here for the roof. I'm doing 10 cash, kind of like the other project we were saying. And then for the two smaller projects, in this example, I'm saying that this applicant is going to be doing a lot of that work themselves, or all that work themselves. So I've calculated 100 hours at $15 an hour to do the siding, with in-kind donation of lumber, which is a number I just plugged in there. And then 200 hours for the window rehabilitation, but then I'm going to purchase those materials there for that work element. So I'm realizing now as I've put this together, I haven't asked for the description of these numbers. So these numbers have descriptive boxes next to them, but these should be represented in the paperwork you send along with your application. So this is an estimate, and we recognize, I think it's going to take me about 100 hours to do this, but you know, we're not sure exactly, and we can be flexible and work with you on that as the project goes forward. But hopefully you have this estimate, and so we can see that that's where this number comes from, and this number, hopefully you've spec'd out some of that material you need to purchase for those windows and have that documentation in the application with your submission. And then you'll notice at the bottom here, another very nice zero discrepancy number. Yeah?
If you've already put a bunch of money into the barn, can you use that in that second column?
That's a great question. It depends on when you put that money into the barn and if you documented it properly. So I kept all those receipts. So every expenditure that is part of the project has to be within the legislative biennium, which started on July 1st of last year. So anything from July 1st on until you get under contract can count toward your match. We can't directly reimburse you for any expenses you made while you were not under contract. So once you do get under contract, any expenses can be either match or directly reimbursed through the grant. So I wish it weren't that way, but you kind of got to draw the line somewhere at some point. So that's the line the state has drawn. So now I'll go through a couple of examples. Brett Farm up in Oak Harbor was a grant recipient last round. This was a simple project of a roof replacement. And as I was saying, the committee focuses on these big three, and a roof replacement can really go a long way to keeping a barn alive. And so we're really happy to see original type materials used. That's not necessarily required. So in the instance of the roof anyway, we certainly recognize that insurance policies go up when you use shingle roofs. Often they're considered a fire hazard, although they can be kind of coated in fireproofing, which does help allay the fears of some insurance companies. That's a bit of a juggle for some of our property owners in the past. But we do allow the use of materials in the case of roofs that would have been historically available. So a lot of people choose to go ahead with metal roofs, but we do love to see those beautiful, beautiful shingled roofs. This is Nina's barn in Squim, also from the last grant cycle, and this barn was actually built as an open barn. So she sent us a couple pictures of herself when her parents built it, and you can see it's still an open barn. And so it had a little bit of structuralization, and here's an example of an updated material on the roof. This is the Prevdell barn in Cedro-Woolley. This is a couple of cycles ago. So they had some siding repair and rehabilitation. And this one I like to show because you'll notice that they didn't replace all the siding. They kept a lot of that historic material as much as they could. So the siding had pretty badly deteriorated, and you can see the window frames also were replaced at the bottom, because that's where the water drips and splashes onto the barn, and that's what deteriorates faster. But they chose wood that was similar in dimension and look to the original, and they didn't replace. They just didn't do a wholesale replacement, which is we really like to see. It didn't bring a picture of. We have some projects of board and batten or vertical siding where people actually just cut off the bottom of the boards that are deteriorated, and then they'll sister join pieces along the bottom, which can look a little goofy like this at first, but after a year or two, you can't even tell the difference. A little bit an interior shot of the Prevdell. Here's another exterior shot. They also did a little bit of structural stabilization for this one, some new concrete footings. And then here it is after. This is the Laporte barn in Newport, and you'll notice in the left-hand picture, we've got a little bit of a lean there. So they did a big lift and foundation repair and stabilization on this one. Again, you'll notice just the bottom is replaced there. And then they did a wonderful paint job. Makes great coat of paint can make a huge difference. The Olson Long Ranch. This one is a stacked rock foundation. And this barn owner kind of went above and beyond. I mean, we've gotten some questions about replacing this type of foundation with something a little bit more stable, more modern, which is something we could make an allowance for. We would probably ask someone to, if they wanted to do concrete footers or foundation, to put some of that rock back on the outside, maybe make it look like it, to reference the historic foundation. But this owner wanted to do it as it was originally done, and so here it is, all repaired. You notice he did add some cages and extra wiring and different things to help with that stability. Here are a couple more shots of that project. This is the Heidenreich Dairy out in Whitman County near Colfax. And this one was a roof replacement and a siding rehab. And this one is really our Heritage Barn logo icon. It's just like one of those really beautiful, iconic views, and it's right along the scenic byway out there in the Palouse. And so it's one of our faves to show off. And then our other fave to show off is the Calf Creek Ranch. So this project, between the time that the owner applied for the grant and received notification that he had received a grant, the barn collapsed. So it didn't look like this when he applied. And so we had thought, I guess that's the end of that project. But turns out he had a friend with a crane. And so they attached that ridge pole to the crane. And as far as I understand, the barn, when it kind of collapsed, it just kind of went whoosh. And so a lot of the material didn't break. And so when they hoisted it up, it kind of all snapped back into place. They, of course, had to do some structural work on the inside to get it all stable again. But then they did siding repair, roof replacement, and there it is. So that was a heavy lift, and that one turned into quite a bit more than he bargained for. And I don't have a number on the overall project budget. I got asked that last night at the other workshop I was doing, so I should look into that and see what he did. But yeah, above and beyond for sure. that crane that his neighbor had was like $10,000 a day for a rental fee, and so he got his match done real fast. so he went above and beyond with the match, that's for sure. So that's the end of my planned presentation, and I'm more than happy to stick around for some questions. I don't think any cemetery folks showed up, but I wanted to leave about 20 minutes for questions, conversation, and just kind of open the floor to make sure got all your questions answered. But of course, I'm available. Phone, email is listed here. I've got some business cards in the back, and then of course my contact information is all over the documents. So yeah. Mr. Hauser, I don't think I actually have his information listed on it. Is it in there?
Directions, yeah, it's under the part where you're trying to figure out the historic value of the farm, because that's how I contacted him.
Yeah, and I let's see. I did, you're right. I did put his information in here. And I'm also happy to send that out to everybody who has put their email on the sheet back there. Oh, there it is. Under eligibility, eligible buildings. This is note, if you have questions about your building's eligibility, contact Michael Hauser, and it's got his email.
Which one is it?
This is the guidelines and procedures. So it's on the kind of the inside page, the first page, under eligible buildings here. The last note under eligible buildings. So,
Thank you.
no problem. If I was thinking ahead, I would have put it in the application too, but yeah.
Okay, it's unrelated to this, sort of.
Sure.
With a nonprofit, we've got a barn. We also have a pretty significant cap. Is there anything in the state that you're aware of to rebuild log cabins? Stabilizing.
You know, we there are a couple of programs available. There's Heritage Capital, which tends to go to sort of larger projects. We have a small grant program called the Valerie Savinsky Fund. So it's up to $2,000. It's intended to be sort of seed money to help get things going. Which county is it in?
Snohomish.
Snohomish might have a heritage grant program as well. I'd have to look it up, but I know King County and Pierce County both have grant programs. It just depends on the county and what they've set some money aside for. But I'm definitely happy to give you more information about the Savinsky program. Is that building on the property as the same property as the barn? And you're a nonprofit? So you're not planning to use the cabin for residential purposes necessarily?
Yeah, we put staff in there.
Okay. That could qualify it to be eligible for this program. If it is a barn or a building that can, contributed to the agricultural practices of the property. We don't fund residences like farmhouses, especially ones people are still living in. But
it's not a permanent living situation, but some can.
Sure. But in the case of a nonprofit, it's not a private residence, so it would be an element of that working landscape. So I would propose it in your application. And there's a section in the application where it says, how would you proceed if you were to get a reduced grant or no grant? So I would say, if under financial need, I would say, if I received a reduced grant, I would focus on those higher priority elements and, list this cabin maybe as a secondary project to the barn. So as you're filling out the application, I'm happy to talk to you about specifics.
I think we need the historic registry first.
Yeah. So that's Mr. Hauser. That's exactly right.
Is it hard to get on the national registry?
It's a bit of a longer form, and there does have to be some element of significance that can speak to a wider national significance. So that doesn't mean it has to be like as important as George Washington's home or a national figure necessarily, but it has to kind of contribute to a larger national narrative in the sense of farming practices in the early 20th century. Excuse me, in Washington. It represents a trend of some sort that's kind of on a national scale. So not everything is eligible. Michael Hauser is actually the person in Washington who manages the National Registry nominations as well. So if you're interested in that, definitely talk to him. And since you're already on the barn register, he'll have information about your barn.
Well, every old person we've ever talked to said there was at one time the Indians came through and built these barns.
Oh, okay.
All on rocks and stumps and.
Yeah, I mean that could definitely qualify as, depending on the details of a kind of more nationally significant piece of our rural heritage. So I would talk to Michael about that. So that meeting I mentioned that meets 3 times a year, they review it's the same process basically, different form, same process. Go through Michael, he makes sure you got everything together. He puts it in front of the committee, they approve it. Usually he doesn't put anything in front of the committee that he hasn't already, worked with to make sure it all checks out. And then it gets sent to Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And they usually don't say no to anything that Michael has already looked over and verified. So, excuse me. Again, he's the main point person for that. Any other questions? Yeah.
If I bought this property in 1914 and somebody had already put a composite roof on it, does that disqualify it from any kind of?
You know, I don't believe that would disqualify it because the roofing material is something that we are a little bit more liberal on. Would replacing the roof be part of your project necessarily?
It's leaning heavily
Mm.
on to the east, and somebody thought that they, well, there's no sill on one side, it's just sinking. And
just
so,
going down.
that the extra weight of the plywood sheeting.
Oh,
and
yeah.
all that kind of stuff is just like contributing to the.
Yeah. If it depends how much plywood. Plywood also is a bit of a sticky material for that old of a barn. Is there plywood just on the roof, or is there plywood on the walls and the interior too?
No, it's just the roof.
Just the roof. Okay. I would send some pictures to Michael Hauser, and then just let him know briefly what you're hoping to apply for, and just say, I recognize that some of these features have changed. This is wrong. So, and he'll be able to give you, since he's the manager of that register, he makes that call.
I mean, the exterior of the barn looks pretty much
Yeah.
attached and stuff, but they put a garage over. So we just,
Yeah.
but I mean, I had a contractor come in, because it was supposed to be at one point, but it's leaning so heavily that previous owners crawled underneath.
Wow.
Cement pad and put, match the same, so he's like, $8,000 to $10,000 to brace and then put, kind of not to really,
Yeah.
not to dig it up, just get a cement pad underneath there so it's not gonna
Go
go
further.
any further.
Yeah.
So
Have you? Has your contractor worked with barns before?
I'm not sure he's a friend,
Okay.
of a friend, so I have to ask.
I mean, we certainly have supported a variety of projects, whether that's just kind of stabilizing in place, like you're saying, so it doesn't go any further.
Yeah.
You saw that Olson Long Ranch of like actually putting a barn back up straight.
Yeah.
So I mean, whatever you determine that you're able to sort of afford at this point and meets your needs and ultimately helps the barn stay in place. We certainly have supported all kinds, but yeah, talk to Michael about the roof. Like I say, I only can't really confidently say because that is the one kind of feature that we do allow a little bit more leeway than others. So for things like siding or interior structure, we do ask that things be of similar materials, wood species if possible. Replicate those dimensions of those historic pieces of wood or those windows, those mullions, those things. We do ask for repair first if possible, if you can salvage that material, and then if you do have to replace, to basically make it as close to the original as possible. So, but like I say, with the roof, it's a little bit of a gray area. Yeah.
If you get historic registry status, does that impede any future use?
Great question. Great question. That actually is maybe a slide I should put in here, so I remember to talk about it. It does not. The register is 100% honorary. So it's, but it does allow you to be eligible to apply for the grant. So that's the benefit. A lot of people like being on the register because they like the recognition. They get the sun eventually, and they like that because they're real proud of their property and their barn. They love the historic nature of it. But a lot of people kind of get on the registry just so they can get access to the grant process. In which case, there is no restriction. If you receive a grant, there are restrictions. So if you do receive a grant and you are utilizing state money, there is an easement that is required. So up to $20,000, it's a 5-year easement. Between 20 and 50, it's a 10-year easement, and then anything over 50, which we've actually never given out, 50 has been our highest, would be a 15-year easement. And that easement basically says that you won't tear it down in that time, and that you also won't make any major changes that wouldn't be allowed in the guidelines that are required for the grant, the rehabilitation work itself. So you basically wouldn't do anything. We wouldn't allow you to do through this process for the next 5 to 10 years, or 15 if you have a really outstanding, expensive project. As I mentioned at the beginning, I did bring those documents if anyone is really concerned about that. It does not mean the public gets open access to your property, but we do ask that you have your property available at least 1 day a year for some sort of scheduled, public access, whether that's an educational program or a tour, but that of course would be prearranged. It wouldn't be just like knock on your door, let me in your arm. So those are kind of the pieces that come with the grant, but nothing with the registry. Any other questions? Well, great. You should all be able to fill out your applications tonight and be done with it. No. Well, and like I say, I am available 9 to 5, Monday through Friday at my office, and I've got lots of spinning plates, especially this time of year. But I'm here to answer questions, and so I kind of tag teamed this program with my colleague Chris Moore. I don't know if any of you know him. He's actually now my boss. He used to manage this program, and so we're kind of trying to transition it more to me. But I was pretty heavily involved last year, so I definitely saw the committee process. I should mention, as staff, I don't make decisions about grant awards. So I receive all the application materials, organize them, put them in packets for the committee. The committee reviews them. The committee is that third element on that early slide that was established through the initiative, the legislation. And that committee reviews and decides on the grants. And then we, as staff, work with you to get all that paperwork filed and kind of keep an eye on your project and make sure things are going smoothly and that things are following the standards and all that good stuff. So I don't make the decisions, but I've seen them make decisions, so I can tell you kind of what I've seen their preferences are, and just those little details that can sometimes make or break your application. In fact, I was just talking to a woman last week who called and said she'd applied last round and she didn't get accepted, and she was wondering if I could tell her why. And I do try to take notes, although I don't take completely thorough notes on every review. So I just opened up her application from last year, and she had actually not provided any match. So she had. Oh, was that you? I was like,
I think I will loan her.
Exactly, and it was a simple mistake, and it was like, oh, well, now I know how to do it right. So anyway, the point is, I'm happy to look over your application just to make sure there aren't any details like that there's just some miscommunication or something that you didn't understand that will just sort of make your application ineligible right from the get-go, because I want everyone's to be as competitive as possible.
Is there a limit, like you have to have like over 500, ask for 500 or more?
Oh, good question.
100 or?
No, good question. So there is not a minimum. I have not seen anything smaller than maybe 2,000-ish. And the committee is happy to fund projects like that, because often that's somebody who's going to do all the work themselves. They just want money for materials. Small projects, maybe it's a small barn. So that definitely happens. I would say the average request is between 20 to 22,000. And then, like I said, our maximum was 50, but even that was kind of an outlier. I would say our larger grants are around 40 to 45. And so if you have a project that's really big and you're asking for $60,000 or $70,000 for $140,000 total budget, that's not going to be as competitive, because the committee really does like to see the the money spread around the state to as many barns as possible. Making sure each project is funded enough to actually be complete. But that's just that kind of says to the committee that you maybe are not working with the right contractor, or that you're doing maybe more work than you need, or just that something is a little off, or anyway. So it just means you're not as competitive. If you're running into problems where you have a much bigger budget than you thought, talk to me. We can kind of work on narrowing it down so that you're making a request that is competitive and palatable for the committee. And if you need some ideas on different people to work with, we do have a list of contractors that I can send out to everybody that have either worked on barns before or other historic buildings, and might be able to help you out. So I'm happy to send that out to anyone who's put their email back there. Yeah.
I have a question about the easement continuity 5, 10, 15 years down the road. What if in 5 years you decided you wanted to put an outdoor stairway going up to the hay lawn?
If your easement is over, we can't stop you. I mean, we wouldn't prefer that, but the legal, the legal restriction ends after that period. So
it would have to be after that period.
Correct. Yes. Okay. So after the easement period.
Even okay.
It's not a perfect system, but the state recognizes that it's private property, but they do want a little bit of bang for the money they've invested. So we've kind of come up with this in between of a temporary easement that goes into the property. I mean, most people who are participating in this program understand the value of that really historic look and that historic nature. And so it's not something we've come across a lot of people, wanting to add a third story or something to their barn after the easement. But yeah, the legal restrictions do run out after whatever time period your grant level requires. Do you have another question?
Yes. In your experience, have you found a lot of resistance between the historic preservation and the permitting system, the local jurisdiction now? Because a lot of times you replace that barn the way it was is not going to meet requirements. Is there a battle there?
I have not run into that a lot. The one thing I mentioned earlier has been an issue of people who want to put shake or shingle back on their roof, and they have a hard time getting permits for that. Mostly because there may be situations where some of these structures are kind of grandfathered in if you're not doing what would be considered a substantial alteration, like adding a story or something like that. It wouldn't kick in. I don't know specifically what each county or municipality requires.
You just said it's not like this ongoing.
It hasn't been a huge issue. So, but of course, we would be happy to kind of help sort out that process if you run into some big roadblocks. We work around the state. We have pretty good relationships. I mean, not literally with every planning department, but we've been in communities around the state, so we can find people to kind of help come up with ideas to make things go smooth. Thank you. Any other questions?
How is it how hard is it to get a hold of you? I mean, we tried to call last week, but we were in your office.
Well, I have been running all around doing workshops the last week or two.
So you're normally in your office?
Most of the time, yeah, I am. We also mentioned our most endangered list a couple earlier in the presentation. I'm also working on that right now, and that one I do site visits for. I'm planning to do 2 site visits next week for that. Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to also. So we just got a new phone system in our office, which is very, very interesting. So I have a direct line that will buzz to my personal cell phone, which I kind of carry around with me anyway. But sometimes it only rings once, and I don't realize until 2 hours later that, I had a call. I didn't even hear it. So we're still working on some kinks with the actual technology of that. But I'm happy to give out that direct line number. Probably should have just put it up here, but it is totally brand new. But usually this is just our main office line, and I'm usually in the office. and if I'm not, email is a quick way to get a hold of me. And if you don't want to type everything out, just say, I'd like to talk to you about barns. Give me a call at this number when you get a chance. I can usually get a hold of you that way too. So I've been trying to be good about listening to my voicemails, but things do get hectic when there's lots of interest. So I'll mention, last time we got about 80 applications for barn grants, and we ended up only being able to get about, I think it was 22 when I was said and done. We had a couple people who ended up not accepting the money for whatever reasons, and we did have a waiting list. And then some money went to another project. We're like, here, have a little bit more. Can do all the work that you asked for. So I can't remember what the exact count was, but it was about a quarter, so one in four we were able to fund. So. All right, well, I'm gonna stick around. Oh, go ahead.
Was that about the same budget?
Oh, good question. No, we have more money this year. So last time it was 405,000 about for the whole state. And this year it is 450. So we have room for one or two more projects, which is a great question. And I will let you know that, like I said, we're working on a very truncated timeline, unfortunately. Usually the budget, we have the applications due in October. We are able to tell people that, so the biennium starts July 1. We get under contract with the state, and then we're able to get all the materials dispersed, hold our workshops, have the applications due in early to mid-October, let people know by Christmas that they've got a grant, which is usually a fun thing to be able to do, and then try to get everybody's contracts written up and signed by January and February, so you have that whole year in summer season, spring, summer, and fall seasons to work on the project. And then you wrap up by the June 30th of the year after that. So you have another 6 months, couple months of good weather maybe at the end to finish anything up. This year, we're working on a very different timeline. So the application's due May 17th. We're gonna try as hard as we can to get them reviewed and get those contracts processed, but we probably won't get them processed till the end of the summer, if not fall. So it's gonna be real tricky to get some of these projects done that need some better weather, at least here on the west side. East side, it's a little easier, more sunshine over there. And I will say, in the past, there have been a few instances where people did not finish their projects in time, and we asked the legislature for a reappropriation of those funds from that biennium to the next. And every time that we've requested, they have granted that. But I always tell people, please don't rely on that, because even though it has worked in the past, I don't want anyone to spend $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 expecting to get half of that back and then not have that and be in dire straits. So don't rely on it, but especially if it's, just a part of a project or a last little bit that there's not a huge risk to you, it's definitely something we can try. And with this whole delay, maybe, I don't know, we'll see how many requests there are and how the legislature feels about that. But if everything goes well, hopefully it will be funded again in the next biennium, 2019 to 2021, because it's a very bipartisan, popular program in our legislature, which is great. So we anticipate it will be funded again, and I think go right for us, we'll be managing it again. So that application process hopefully will start July 1, or the project process will start July 1 of 2019, and then hopefully have those applications due that fall. So because we're so far into this cycle, there actually is another cycle coming up next year. So if this is too short of a time period for you guys, or you don't think you can get your project done by the 30th of June, we do have that next cycle, if all goes well, coming up not too far from now. So that is another option.
So you apply with all your quotes or estimates from whoever, and then you get pre-approved, then you go spend your own money?
So what happens is you apply with all your quotes and your estimates, and you go under contract with the state. So there's actually a contract document that's written up, drawn up.
Complete it before a certain date, then we'll give you this much.
Exactly. And the money is already appropriated. So the money's just sitting there waiting to give to you. Once the project's done, you keep track of your expenses, you send that documentation into us, we send it to the state, and then they cut you a check. So another question I've been asked is sometimes on these bigger projects, people will request sort of a mid-project reimbursement, which is something we will allow. I mean, it's more paperwork for us, and so we prefer to minimize those if at all possible. We don't want, getting a $100 reimbursement check here and a $500 reimbursement check there. But for some people, the way that they set up their project is, they have a $40,000 project, so they do 20,000 of it, and then they get 10,000 of that back, and that 10,000 can then go toward the next 20,000 if that's a financial help for if your situation. We're certainly willing to work with you on that. So yeah, we certainly understand that that reimbursement or midway reimbursement can be kind of a catalyst for getting the second half of the project done if it kind of neatly fits into that two-piece model or multiple pieces. So we can work with you on that.
And then let's say you were approved for partial funding this round, you could reapply for the remainder stuff for the next round.
Absolutely. You are welcome to apply. I feel obligated to say we have never awarded a grant money to the same property twice, which doesn't mean we couldn't. It just hasn't happened yet. We've only this will be our 6th round of grants. So because it's a 2-year cycle, the program's been around for almost 12 years now, but it does kind of stretch out a little bit. So I certainly would encourage you to apply, especially if in your application you kind of presented it as, I'm doing my project in pieces. Last year I presented you with this, you awarded me with this grant. Now I'm working on this, as kind of the idea of spreading a larger grant over multiple periods. I think that would be an appealing way to present it, as opposed to like, well, I got $40,000 last year, let's try again and get more, like that sort of thing. So, I think a lot of it depends on how you present it to the committee as well, because they read them, they read all the details, they read them through pretty thoroughly and discuss them pretty thoroughly too. So, and those details they consider. I will also mention along those lines, each applicant can only apply for one grant per cycle. So even if you own multiple barns or multiple properties that would be eligible, we only allow an individual applicant to apply for one grant per cycle. But you would be more than welcome to apply for a future grant for a different property. Or if there are 2 barns on one legal parcel, which is not terribly common, but has happened, especially with some of those larger farmsteads, or bigger industrial type agricultural buildings. You can apply for those barns. It would be one application, one project that would encompass multiple buildings. So just like you could apply for barn rehabilitation and some of your outbuildings, you could apply for 2 barns if they're on the same legal parcel. So, which I didn't mention actually with the outbuildings, if you have a milking parlor or other outbuilding, that can be a part of your application. Typically, what I would recommend is having your budget set up so that the grant money is going toward the larger building, and then the repair or work on the outbuilding is part of your match. So whatever money or time you're spending on that counts as match. That's how I would recommend the setup. But they're certainly eligible for funding. There's some really cool, unique silos out there, different things that I think are really exciting for the committee too. So the committee certainly loves to see farmsteads intact. So all those buildings that contributed to the working nature of the landscape are part of the whole story, part of the whole heritage.
Is that an antique outhouse, a 2-seater, on Old Grove?
That's a good question. I don't know. Is the outhouse associated with the farmhouse or with
the barn and then a little tractor shed and an outhouse?
I don't think so. I mean, that's a bit of a gray area, but
Brown area.
yeah, potato. people often ask about farmhouses because they're obviously part of a farmstead. Unfortunately, that's just kind of a line that they've drawn, no residences, unless it's a different case with maybe a nonprofit entity using it for, agricultural purposes. Thank you. Have a good evening. Thank you so much for coming. Safe travels back to the east side of the state. Anyway, but if there's an outhouse associated with the barn, as long as wasn't maybe an outhouse specifically for the residents, I would think that would count. So yeah, that's interesting. I would say that wouldn't be a super compelling project for the committee. Not that they wouldn't say, no, we don't want to fund this, but it would be kind of maybe like, well, that's not the one we want to focus on, so we're going to grant you just enough to get the other work done. That's a possibility. So, but I would say if that's part of your project and that's part of the property, I would definitely include it.
You do say no.
Exactly. So, all right. Well, I'm happy. I'm going to stick around for another few minutes, clean up. So if anyone wants to chat some more, I can certainly do that. But
Thank you.
Thank you.
say good night. Yeah. Actually, sorry. Let me hit this.
I was just gonna mention to you on your